So we're continuing the Great ILIG tradition of hearing from the CILIP president at our annual general meeting. Delighted to welcome John Trevor-Allen to join us today. John began his career as a cataloguer in academic libraries, followed by a graduate traineeship and a master's at Aberystwyth. After graduation, he took on a reference and social role for Oxfordshire libraries, and then worked as a clinical outreach librarian in the NHS. Today, he manages a site library at the UK Health Security Agency, which must have been exciting over the last few years, alongside his role with CILIP, and has a voluntary role as the chair of the RDA board, helping to drive the strategic development of the RDA metadata standard. Outside librarianship, he is also a school governor, a volunteer for a non-profit organisation, and a trustee of the Family Rights Group, which works to keep children safe in families. As his Twitter bio says, he is busy. So we're very grateful for his time today. John is going to talk about the opportunities and potential pitfalls of cross-cultural information management in a time of growing international tensions. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Leslie. As that potted biography sort of indicates, my background is not particularly in international relations or geopolitics, so I'm not an expert on this. It's very possible that those of you listening will have more specialist knowledge than I have. But what I do have is the enormous privilege to be the CILIP president, to have been the former chair of CILIP and of the CILIP Ethics Committee, and also, as Leslie says, to be the chair of the RDA board managing the international strategic development of the RDA metadata standard. So I've got some exposure to a fairly broad range of issues currently affecting libraries and information professionals on the global stage. And what I'd like to do in this talk really is to touch on a couple of those perspectives and to offer some ideas around the new and emerging challenges. That feels a little risky. I'm not an expert in geopolitics, but I know enough history to know that anyone who's setting themselves up to try and predict any sort of challenge in what they themselves describe as a time of rising tensions leaves themselves open to being an embarrassing example in source B in a future history textbook. But I think that's a risk that is worth taking. In strategy discussions, I find people often say that there are three key questions. What is working, what isn't, and what should our priority be? And what I usually find is that there's a hidden fourth question, which is more important, and that's the question, what are we missing? I'm not in a position to answer what are we missing, but I hope I'm in a good position to spark some thoughts and to give you some ideas that you can mull over separately and look for the ideas and opportunities they might invite. I think what are we missing is a dangerous question because it's so deceptively hard to answer, but it is often a fairly huge question in librarianship. My own most immediate examples of this are from health librarianship. I was quite busy at the UK Health Security Agency through the pandemic, producing a weekly COVID care homes evidence digest briefing paper that went to the chief medical officer and the Secretary of State and tried to say, look, this is what's going on in the rest of the world. And it was terribly useful to be able to say, okay, in Massachusetts, they're trying this, and the evidence suggests it doesn't work, which saved a lot of trouble in terms of us needing to try it here and discovering that the evidence suggests it didn't work. But actually, I'm going to use a slightly different example to illustrate why I think cross-cultural information management is so important. By cross-cultural information management, what I really mean is the sharing of information which it's acceptable to share between organizations at more or less all levels. I'm not touching on sensitive or privileged information, but the information that you can share, I think, is important because depending on the context you're working in, that can be anything from sharing with partner libraries to non-profits to government or departmental agencies. But it's important to bear in mind that the information you need to share might not come from a partner organization. It could come from somewhere else entirely and still be of more value once you've shared it. As you've no doubt heard, data needs to be mobilized to become information, and the information has to be acted on to become knowledge. So in the sphere of global public health, I want to turn to a recent viral epidemic, the West African Ebola outbreak of 2013 to 2016. It's been very much overshadowed by the COVID pandemic these days, but you might remember at the time it was the largest Ebola outbreak in history. The WHO declared it as a public health emergency of international concern back in August 2014. And while concerted international efforts did eventually help bring the outbreak under control, that wasn't before at least 11,000 people had been killed. And after local healthcare services were pushed to and beyond breaking points, that we got the epidemic back under control. The index case for that, as far as we've been able to determine, was the death of a 2-year-old boy in Guinea in 2013, probably following a bite from an infected bat. And we knew, at least the medical and public health community knew, that Ebola was a public health problem in sub-Saharan Africa. But the first documented cases, which were identified in 1976, were in Zaire and in Sudan, today the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan. So apart from a single paper published in The Lancet in 1995 called Isolation and Partial Characterization of a New Strain of Ebola Virus, which recorded a non-fatal human case of Ebola in the Ivory Coast, there was nothing to particularly indicate that Ebola was an issue of concern in West Africa. When you add to that the broader socio-political situation in West Africa, a context where healthcare systems are often extremely poor, where successive conflicts had led to enormous distrust both between and of governments, it's possible to see just how it was that a steadily rising number of Ebola cases in humans went unnoticed for months. The R rate steadily growing and growing because medical practitioners who had no way to imagine there was a risk of Ebola transmission failed to identify it as a diagnosis until we looked up and saw we were in the middle of the worst recorded outbreak of Ebola in history. The fact is, things got out of control because people did not know what it was they were missing. Obviously, they knew Ebola was an alarming diagnosis, but they had no way to know that it was a probable diagnosis in their region, except that that's a lie. There was a way for them to know. Nobody told them. But actually, researchers had identified Ebola was probably endemic in West Africa more than 30 years earlier. The paper is called A Serological Survey on Viral Hemorrhagic Fevers in Liberia. It's by Knobloch, Albiez, and Schmitz, and it was published in the Annals of Virology in 1982. In Liberia, south of Guinea, where the 2013 outbreak began, west of Ivory Coast, where the 1995 case was recorded, in 1982, this paper recorded Ebola antibodies present in human blood samples. The numbers were small. About 6% of all the samples they studied showed Ebola antibodies, but they were significant. And the paper's authors commented that considering that active cases of Ebola or Marburg virus disease have never been reported from Liberia, the occurrence of these antibodies was surprising. The results seem to indicate that Liberia has to be included in the Ebola virus endemic zone, and medical personnel in Liberian health centers should be aware of the possibility and be prepared to avoid nosocomial epidemics. But medical personnel on the ground weren't aware of that, and why would they be? It was a single paper, it was published in 1982, and it went more or less completely unnoticed and unmobilized until after the Ebola outbreak had gained a shockingly firm foothold. So what we are missing matters. Not just what we're missing here, but what we know here, which could be knowledge missing somewhere else. Managing, mobilizing, and utilizing knowledge allowing cross-cultural and transnational information management to bring evidence to bear at the point of need is important. It can also be extremely challenging, and for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is simply that sometimes the political situation where you live is not conducive to international cooperation. I want to pick my words carefully here because I don't want to overextend my knowledge or cast undue aspersions. But an example of the challenges presented by working across cultures is one that I came across during my term on the board of RDA, although it was before I became chair. In case you don't know, the RDA metadata standard is developed by the RDA Steering Committee, or RSC, and the RDA board sets the overall strategic direction. The board is made up of regional representatives from key national institutions around the world, and we aim to select representatives from different national institutions to fill each vacancy as it arises. The list of past and current board members is available online, so I'm not betraying any confidences if I reveal the previous representative for the Asia region to the board of RDA was Ben Gu from the National Library of China. Ben is an incredibly able librarian, an accomplished translator, an incredibly experienced cataloguer, and a long-standing member of IFLA. And honestly, his commitment to information science is awe-inspiring. To have him as a member of the board of RDA, able to share his insights and contributions, presented an incredible opportunity to the board, not just in setting out our strategic priorities to develop and enhance the standard, but also in taking advantage of the cultural perspective that Ben could bring to help explore how RDA as a standard accommodated the needs and priorities of Chinese librarianship in particular, and some of the metadata needs and concerns across Asia in general. Instead, we ran into a number of issues, and I will say outright, I don't know how they could have been solved. Once a year, when pandemics permit, the RDA board meets in person, and in fact, I'm away all next week to chair a joint meeting of the board and the RSC. But for the rest of our quarterly meetings, because it is not practical to bring people together from across 6 continents once a quarter, we conduct our business over the collaboration site Basecamp. Except that Ben, who was based in China, could not access Basecamp. As a website, as a platform for collaboration and remote co-working for colleagues spread around the world, it was completely unavailable to him. He could not access it. And Ben was also unable to secure permission to attend the face-to-face meetings, and he could not participate in video calls. Now, again, I'm trying to be scrupulously fair. There's a number of factors potentially in play here. Internet access can be unreliable. The language barrier can make it harder for some board members to participate fully in strategic discussions because the working language of the board is English. And of course, membership of the RDA board is a voluntary commitment on top of everything else a person does. And as I have cause to know, sometimes that's quite a lot. But the time frame in which this is taking place is also the first half of 2019, which means it was a time when Donald Trump had implemented tariffs on the import of Chinese goods to the United States, a time when those tariffs had just been increased from 10 to 25%, and a time when the telecoms company Huawei had instigated legal proceedings against the United States in response. And I think it would be unreasonable not to at least consider the possibility that the, at that time, deteriorating diplomatic relationship between the US and China played at least some part in Ben's inability to attend board discussions in Chicago. As librarians, that's pretty much completely out of our control. I think often the impact of high-level diplomatic policy will be out of our control. But I genuinely think that the whole profession, and particularly RDA, lost out as a result. One of our core strategic aims at RDA is to decentralize and, in effect, decolonize metadata standards. The extraordinarily Anglo-centric model of metadata management, which was laid down in 1967's Anglo-American Cataloging Rules and in 1978's AACR2, is something we're actively striving to get away from. And to achieve that, what we really need is input from voices from a multiplicity of cultures. Where broader political barriers start to prevent pitfalls which prevent those voices from being shared, it diminishes our ability to effectively share and mobilize information across borders. At the same time, we can't allow a catchy strapline like the importance of cross-cultural information management to let us undermine the core values of librarianship. By training, I have an abiding love of neutrality. Two of my earliest volunteering roles were as a Nightline volunteer and as a Samaritan. And I know extremely well how very important it can be to talk to someone who can simply listen without feeling the need to start putting their own spin on something. And incidentally, that's a crucial ability in mobilizing evidence for policy decisions as well. But I think there is a difference between carefully managed neutrality, the ability to staff the reference desk in a public library and handle an inquiry from a single mother with a screaming baby in exactly the same way you'd handle an inquiry from an octogenarian die-hard family history researcher, and a more, I'm going to say, purblind insistence on neutrality that could tempt you to prioritize international cooperation over your own principles. When we redeveloped the CILIP ethical framework, we very deliberately ensured that the first of our ethical principles was the promise to promote, uphold, and defend human rights. Everything else we do flows from respect for the person. If we as a profession fail to respect human rights, or if we collude with those who fail to respect human rights, everything else we do is undermined. The role which libraries play in supporting a free and democratic society, in opening access to information and culture, is essential. And we can't afford to compromise that in the name of cross-cultural cooperation. Because if we compromise, if we become selective in our defense of human rights, we will find ourselves awkwardly aligned with those whose view of information management is far more extreme, whose motives in managing information are to limit it in order to present a narrower worldview that serves their own ideological ambition rather than a goal of opening access to information. I was extremely privileged last year to be able to attend a meeting of the All Parties Parliamentary Library Group, where the guest speaker was Alexander Chechenko, Ukraine's Minister of Culture and Information Policy. And one of the most striking points he made was related to the systematic way Russian forces have been targeting Ukraine's libraries, their cultural institutions, and in particular works in Ukrainian. Since the occupation of Crimea in 2014, Ukrainian language works have been systematically removed and destroyed, and in particular, Ukrainian translations of Western texts. In Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine since their invasion last year, this policy has been replicated. Libraries and museums have been targeted for airstrikes, books and cultural resources have been deliberately destroyed. And this really represents the opposite of what I've advocated for, the logical extreme, the horrifying opposing reaction to cross-cultural information sharing is willful monocultural isolationism, which seeks to purge libraries and collections of any holdings which run counter to the desired narrative of a hostile state, of a malevolent ideology, of a calculated countercultural backlash, or of a moral minority which views unfettered access to information as an existential threat to their ideological goals. To a certain type of worldview, cross-cultural information management can seem extreme because it presents an existential threat. Only last week, the executive director of the American Library Association, Tracy D. Hall, accepted her nomination as one of the Time 100 by reminding us all that free people read freely. Free people think create, live, and as information professionals, our goal should be to enable and support that freedom, to foster cross-cultural information management and access wherever we can and wherever it is threatened. Which, of course, isn't to say that that is an easy goal. Certainly, as I said at the start, this is not an area where I have anything like the depth of knowledge to hand you all a guide to getting a quick win. But I think it needs to be something we consider on a regular basis, an instance where we need to stay open to the opportunities which can help us work towards those goals. That certainly is the aim of the CILIP international strategy. The current version was developed from a presidential commission by one of my predecessors as CILIP president, Ayub Khan, back in 2018. And it's due to be reviewed and revised by the CILIP board this year. So I won't attempt to second guess what the future of that strategy will look like. But I will hope that its core tenets survive. The full strategy, of course, is available on the CILIP website, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. But its core principles fundamentally distill down to three. To collaborate in programs which advance the international contribution of librarianship, of freedom of expression, and of culture. To maximize the soft power of the information profession and increase our influence, and to support the growth of library science and facilitate knowledge exchange. And I think that is at the core of what we as a profession need to bear in mind. Yes, there are absolutely potential pitfalls, limitations which can be placed on international and cross-cultural cooperation by states or organizations or pressure groups or even simple technical limitations. But the core goal, the opportunity we should always be striving to enable and create, is a world in which information can be shared more easily, in which it can be acted on more readily, in which it can be accessed more freely. It takes time and effort and setbacks to build the sorts of relationships that can enable that kind of cross-cultural information sharing, that kind of open information management. And in a time of rising international tensions, there will absolutely be occasions when the setbacks outpace and diminish the amount of effort that's being put in. There are pitfalls that cannot be avoided, but that should not stop us. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. And we in the information profession are a vital support in protecting that right. Our information management skills are key to ensuring that information can be imparted to those who wish to access it. And whatever the pitfalls and challenges, whatever the level of international tension, we should always seek the opportunities that will allow us to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was fascinating. I wasn't expecting you to start with Ebola for some reason. That was really striking, but and fascinating, and a challenge to us, I think. Gave us a lot to think about. Does anybody...
Hopefully a supportive challenge.
A supportive challenge, yes, but definitely a challenge. Does anybody have any questions for John?
Yes.
Alice.
Could someone or some group do a root and branch check of the information on the CILIP website to make sure that it is accurate, consistent, and not a sort of what it appears to be at the moment, a hodgepodge of all sorts of things, where you can get page 1 has been revised, but the revisions of the text of page 1 have not been followed through to all the following pages?
Yes, I will feed that back, Alice. Thank you. I will say we have a WordPress site at work, and it suffers. I think this might be a problem that all websites grow to suffer from over time.
Yes.
In that they grow and it becomes increasingly hard to keep track of what needs updating where. But I will absolutely feed that back. Thank you.
There's a particular point, and that is that it says that the Royal Charter granted to the Library Association was it 1888? Was actually, I think, 1887.
It should, yes, it should be getting that right because it's our 125th year. So
It is.
Well, if you check,
if we're out by one somewhere on the website, that sends completely the wrong impression.
Okay.
check the Privy Council Office website.
Okay.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you, Alice. Does anybody have any questions for John specifically on his talk, first of all? Mirka, yes, do go ahead.
Hello, thank you.
Hi.
I'm from Shropshire Libraries, but it was a really interesting talk. Thank you very much for that. And I wanted to ask, you mentioned about because of different political issues in countries, some of the participants can't participate through Basecamp. Do you have any ways of how they can kind of join in the discussion about and such a huge decisions as well? Is there a different way for them to engage?
So to an extent there is, and also hi, because I'm from Shropshire, so lovely
cool.
to meet you.
Brilliant.
I grew up in Newport on sort of Staffordshire.
Oh, fantastic.
But yes, so the bulk of our asynchronous meetings we do over Basecamp, and they normally run for a week. But within each of those weeks, we arrange 1 or 2 2-hour video calls on a different platform, which allows some live discussion as well. It is completely impossible to arrange those for a time that isn't miserable for somebody. There's always someone getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning and sat there huddling a coffee. But in most cases, except for the specific example I've given, the countries that colleagues are from have been able to access at least one or the other. Ben in China could access neither, but I think that was probably a very local set of circumstances. In general, we maximize the participation, and it is possible to collaborate without even actively logging into Basecamp. I know IFLI use Basecamp, so you may have seen if you reply to a message sent from Basecamp, it will sort of post it into the Basecamp thread as well. So there are workarounds, yes.
It was really interesting as well in regards to Ukraine and the way that it's very targeted attack. I grew up in communist Czechoslovakia, so it was very similar in regards to getting rid of cultural kind of belonging ideas. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Christy.
Christy Ikeogu. John, thank you for the presentation. I think it was really wonderful what you shared and how much cross-cultural information management can help us all to get on with our work and also to feel free in the world. And not just talking about freedom of expression, but freedom of people who will be able to come up to say something, but become vulnerable because of the place, their location in the world. And, it's, for instance, what's happened to Ukraine can happen to any other minority community. And what we have to bear in mind is that there are individuals who would not say something because they are afraid of what would happen. They're afraid of their lives. And some of the countries in the world it's not just the person who is speaking up, it's the family of these people. So I'm not sure how libraries or librarians can, cooperatively help individuals who feel vulnerable when they make information known.
That is a really good point. I'm not going to pretend that I have a simple answer to it, because I don't think there's a way I can try and offer a pat solution that does not diminish the strain that people in that sort of situation are going to be under.
Mm.
What we've tried to do, at least with the CILIP ethical framework, was to make it a policy shield, something that you can hide behind as a professional and say, well, look, this is what I have to do. Because when you're, I think partly when you're up against that sort of weaponized bureaucratic attitude, having a friendly bureaucratic attitude to back you up is a help. It is ultimately down to the individual circumstance, and I think all that we can do in a lot of cases is say, we are here and we will stand by you, and you hope that everyone else is going to stand by you as you say that. But yeah, it is incredibly difficult, and it's always going to be on a case-by-case basis. And I think those of us with the luxury of more security need to model absolute best practice, and everyone else should go as far as it is safe for them and their family to do so.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any more questions? I was just thinking while Christy was speaking about the Ukrainian librarian who was prosecuted. This was before the most recent war started in Ukraine, who was prosecuted for running a Ukrainian library in Moscow. Was it in Moscow? I can't remember now, rather shamefully. But also about that rather uncomfortable community, which is librarians in Russia. I think we do not know what they are thinking and what, and we do not know if there is any way that we can support any Russian librarians in Russia. And I don't know if CILIP has made any contact. I know contact is very controversial.
It's incredibly challenging, and I would have to check.
Yeah.
But it's I live with someone who works for an international company, and they have colleagues on their team who are based in Ukraine. They have colleagues who have to go to co-working spaces with diesel generators when the electricity substations are shelled. And they have colleagues on their team who are in Russia and who are struggling to get paid, because it's quite hard to pay people in Russia at the moment because they've been excluded from the international banking system. And I think, it's hideously complicated, and it does come down to people are people and the individual should be respected. It does not in any way mean you should like the regime that they live under. But you should remember human beings deserve protection.
And there is a difference between the individual and the organisation for which they work. Ian, do you have your hand up? There's a white hand on your screen. I don't know what it means.
I've surrendered, I think. No, it was Aidan that had his hand up.
No, it's okay.
Yes, I did.
Aidan, you did. Go on.
Yes, my question was, how far do perhaps unexpected developments in public opinion affect your work? I mean, you began by talking about Ebola. In countries where perhaps not the official policy, but there's a strong strain of, for instance, anti-vax opinion or COVID skepticism. How far does that impinge on what you do?
Well, I I'm not in vaccine development. I'm in libraries of knowledge. So insofar as it affects what I do, it increases the amount of evidence to look at, to be honest. When UKHSA is doing research, we're doing it on the UKHSA library side. Our role is to save time for scientists and researchers in the broader organisation and to get them the evidence they need to make the policy recommendations that have the strongest evidential base. Certainly when I was preparing the Care Homes Digest, we were getting, towards the end of that, we were getting wildly differing reports from, for example, more red states and the situation in care homes in areas where there hadn't been lockdowns and where there was low vaccine uptake versus areas which had earlier or higher enforcement or which pushed vaccines harder or where the uptake was greater. Public opinion and public reactions impact the evidence base, because so often in sort of public policy, what people do impacts the data that can be gathered and reported on. They don't, I think, change any of the recommendations that we would make, because if we run an evidence briefing, we say, this is what all of the evidence says, the consensus is such and such, there you go. So it broadens the evidence base, but it doesn't, I wouldn't say, impact a policy recommendation, although again, I do not personally make policy recommendations.
Thanks.
Thank you. Is anybody else? I have another question, which is, again, I was thinking about some of the work that I've certainly done, I know colleagues will have done, and our members will have done, supporting education in other countries as part of international strategies of our employers. And some of the ethical issues which have arisen in relation to that, in dealing with countries which do not share our ethical approaches to information. And I wondered if you had any sort of practical advice about how individual library staff might approach these questions in the context of their institutions.
Gosh, I think that is probably one where it needs to be brought up inside the institution. You obviously you don't want to find yourself in a position where you're going against policy, because that ultimately serves nobody very well. But I certainly think it is always worth, if you think there is something wrong with the policy, I think it is worth challenging it internally. It might be that there's something going on that no one has thought to tell you that rapidly refocuses your perspective, but it might be that the policy is a damn stupid policy. I think it's always worth asking, why are we doing it this way?
Exactly.
Is this the right thing to be doing? And beyond a certain point, you have to sort of work with what you get back from that. There's an element, I think, in any sort of attempting to do the correct thing from an ethical perspective, you have to trust that the people you're dealing with are also ethical. But usually they are, or at least that's been my experience. So possibly I've just been very fortunate.
Yes, or there might be I was thinking, for example, about work that I've been involved in the Gulf states, or we talked a bit about Russia, but where you might have serious doubts about the approaches that are going on there, but there is a general feeling that the institution can go out and do good things.
Yes,
how true that is.
Again, I absolutely understand that. I think there is, as with so many ethical dilemmas, I think there is a wide and variably fuzzy grey area between being involved to do good things because anything is better than nothing, and being involved and then you look around and it turns out that actually what you've been doing is collaborating.
Yes.
And that's really challenging. I think it's just one of those things that you have to, it's a terrible metric, but I think if it's keeping you awake at night more than it's helping you to sleep, then you need to reevaluate. I think you just need to be aware, and just because you did something yesterday does not mean it is still the right thing tomorrow.
Yeah.
I think a lot of that sort of thing starts with awareness and not just sleepwalking into it because, oh, well, you've given such and such. So actually, it's perfectly reasonable to extend that relationship a bit further. I think you have to keep asking yourself difficult questions.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Any more questions for John? No? Well, it's just gone 4 o'clock. So if that is all our questions, then I'd just like to thank John very much for such a fascinating talk. I think you've really made us think. So if we can thank John, stick your hands in the,
Thanks very much.
And thank you to everybody for attending our annual general meeting. The talk, I think, will be up on our YouTube channel, but probably, I don't know if we put the annual general meeting there or not. Someone can tell me later. So all I have to say is thank you very much to everybody for attending, and I hope to see you all in a couple of weeks when Jamie Finch will be talking about supporting transnational education, which might well have some. That's on the 24th of May at 4 o'clock online. And today's talk might well inform the discussion there as well. So thank you very much to everybody and see you next time.
Take care. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Really good.